Zelda 1 tells the tale of a young man clad in his pajamas who wanders around collecting bribe money from crusty cave dwellers and using said money to develop a gambling addiction. Wow, this game's a lot more twisted the more you dig into it. But one of the main things this game is recognized for is being soul-crushingly, mind-numbingly difficult. I mean, half the things you do in this game don't even make any sense. Need to drain this lake to unlock a secret dungeon? Flute. Need to get past this hungry enemy so that you can progress to the next room? Well, you just give him some meat. So that actually kind of makes sense, but the guy straight up disappears when you give it to him? That's some mystery meat right there.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Now that's all in the base game, but what if I told you there was a mode to this game more devious and cryptic, more grueling, and would even cause veteran Zelda players to quake in their iron boots? Well, meet NES Zelda 1's Second Quest. When Nintendo was working on creating Zelda 1, their initial intention was to just have one quest. But during developments, one of the directors of Zelda 1, Takashi Tezuka, accidentally only used half the data available to make the dungeons. Shigeru Miyamoto, the game's producer, said this was okay and decided to use the remaining data to create the second quest dungeons, where the second quest has none of the same dungeons in the first quest, but the overworld looks almost identical between the two versions, and all the items and upgrades you collect are the same between the two. So basically, if Takashi Tezuka didn't mess up, we wouldn't be blessed with the second quest. So I guess I have this man to thank for all the pain you'll see me experience in this video. Also, I had never played the second quest before, so all of my footage and reactions are of someone playing this game blind. And at no point during my playthrough did I look up the solutions of where I needed to go next to progress, or cheat using save states. So can I beat this beast of a game mode totally blind without any cheats? Well, let's find out. The beginning of my playthrough started out very similar to the first quest. I got the starting sword from the old man conveniently a stone's throw away from my spawn point and made my way straight over to level 1, which I was surprised to learn is the exact location as the first quest. At first, I thought I accidentally wasn't playing the second quest, which I thought couldn't be the case because I typed Zelda in my file name, and nope, never mind. This dungeon is leaps and bounds harder than the one in the first quest. And so after getting murdered by some, Gorilla? Honestly, I can't even blame them for killing Link. If my name rhymed with diarrhea, I would want to go on a murderous rampage too. I then quickly found myself unable to progress to any further rooms, as I was pretty sure I needed to bomb a wall, but I hadn't picked up any bombs at that point. So I began wandering around the overworld. I decided I would visit a lot of the hotspots from the first quest to see if I could nab any useful goodies there, where I found the level 6 location from the first quest netted me a 30 rupee surprise, which helped me purchase one of the most useful items in this playthrough, the blue candle. The blue candle lets you unlock secret areas by burning trees, which are super plentiful throughout the overworld. Granted, every time I wanted to check a tree for a secret, I had to blindly light it on fire without any indication a hidden area would be unlocked. But it's the baby steps that count. And before I knew it, I took out a blue moblin and was able to acquire my first bombs in the game. With that, I returned to level 1 to blast a hidden passageway open and encountered an insanely difficult room with blue boomerang guys and fireballs flying all over the place, and died almost immediately. I would love to see anyone kill all the enemies in this room without losing all 3 hearts because I think it's nearly impossible. I just ended up running past the enemies to the next room, which worked out great and took out the same level 1 boss from the first quest, Aquamentus. But man, what a tough dungeon for the first one in the game. With this one being so difficult, I was worried about what things of nightmares the endgame dungeons would have in store for me. But at that point, I tried to stay positive and focus on tracking down the next dungeon. Only after 20 minutes or so after beating level 1, I checked the secret shop from the first quest where you can purchase the blue ring, and I stumbled across level 2. This dungeon had some tricky combat sections, and I actually took out the manhandle mini-boss with style using a singular bomb. And quite honestly, I feel like that's the only way I could have taken that guy out, because there's no way in King Rahome Bossmorus Hyrule's left nut that I could have taken him out with just my basic sword and 4 hearts to my name. Now at this point, I was introduced to a game mechanic of the second quest not present in the first quest. A mechanic so random and cryptic that many people quote this as their reasons for despising this version of the game. Just see for yourself. Yeah, you can walk through the walls and the dungeons of this game. And this mechanic shows up in most of, if not all of the remaining dungeons in this game, And I honestly don't think there's any sort of indication or hint that this mechanic was introduced in this version. No arrows pointing to the wall, not even a cryptic sentence fragment of a statement from an old man. But let me know in the comments if I'm missing some sort of indication here. Also, what's worse about this is that in order to walk through the walls, you have to walk against it for a solid second or so to trigger the screen transition. So it's not a mechanic that's easy to discover accidentally. I actually learned about this mechanic from reading your guys' comments in my video where I cover my blind playthrough of the first quest, so I have you guys to thank for saving me so much headache in this regard. And quite honestly, I prefer the walking through the walls mechanic over bombing them, because if you run out of bombs, you have to exit the dungeon and grind for them, but rubbing up against walls consumes 0 resources and is super easy to check. And so before I knew it, I got the flute item, which has the ability to unlock secret areas of the overworld if played on certain map screens. So super valuable in my ability to progress in this playthrough. And before I knew it, I made my way to the dungeon's boss, which I took out super carefully by spamming sword beams at him from afar with Link at full health. Immediately after exiting the dungeon, I tried playing the flute on the screen that unlocks level 7 from the first quest, and... nothing. I guess I'll have to check somewhere else for that dungeon location. I then picked up the white sword upgrade because I had enough heart containers to do so, and after getting scanned by an old lady in a cave, I scaled up the mountain and... dang, seriously just a fairy healing spot? That's a level 5 location in the first quest. The dungeons in this mode must really be hidden well because I was seriously starting to run out of places to check. Luckily though, after not too much wandering around, I noticed an overworld screen different from the first quest where I found a lake, and upon playing my flutes, I unlocked level 3. We're still in business. The enemies in this dungeon were stronger than the previous two, but my higher damage white sword made combat much easier. Also, something I found super bizarre here is that the boss was placed in the middle of the dungeon instead of the very end, where I picked up the heart container and still had a bit more dungeon to play through until I acquired the Triforce piece, which I found pretty crazy. Now with my crap ton of rupees I had saved up at this point in the game, I purchased my favorite optional item in the game, the blue ring, which halves damage received from enemies. So not required in the slightest to beat the game, but super useful because the combat is so brutal in this game, as you'll especially see with the later dungeons. This blue ring was hidden in a super obscure spot, where you had to walk through a rock wall to get it, but because I was familiar with this secret area to obtain 100 rupees in the first quest, I knew to check this area in the second quest. I then wandered around some more, checking first quest goodie locations, where I found the grave containing the magical sword was inaccessible, but I pushed another grave nearby and I stumbled across the heart container, my first one obtained not located within a dungeon. I also was pleased to discover the power bracelet being in the same location as the first quest, where unlike the first quest, the power bracelet is required to collect to beat the game in the second quest, as you'll soon see. I then did a bunch of random stuff that led to dead ends. I stumbled across the letter item that I showed to an old woman to unlock healing potions I could buy, and actually found the magical sword by randomly pushing a block, but I sadly couldn't acquire it yet because I didn't have enough heart containers. I then stumbled across an old man hint that I could only imagine was an oversight of the developers. So in the first quest, you can stumble across an old man under an armor statue that says, "Secret is in the tree at the dead end," where the well-accepted solution to this hint is a level 8 dungeon location you can unlock by burning a tree at the dead end of a narrow path. But, in the second quest, they left the same hint in the game, but moved the level 8 location, so now burning the tree does absolutely nothing. And I tried using all of the items at my disposal to try and unlock a secret at this tree. The bombs, flute, heck, even the darn piece of meat. And none of them did squat. So not only is this game cryptic as balls, I now have to worry about hints in this game that may or may not be true because the developers forgot to remove them. Now at this point, I was starting to run out of leads on areas to check for the remaining dungeon locations. I started to wander around pushing blocks with my power bracelet, and burning random trees here and there with my blue candle, when a block I pushed gave away, and I found the entrance to level 4. There was zero indication this random block would lead to a dungeon, so this dungeon location is honestly pretty ridiculous. But I guess if you're thorough and try pushing every block you come across like I was doing, you're bound to find it eventually because there aren't that many blocks to push in the overworld. Level 4 is probably the hardest dungeon yet, but it wasn't that crazy. The combat sections were manageable, and the only real headache came from trying to navigate the place. There were many staircases and invisible passageways to neighboring rooms, as well as dodongos that needed to be bombed to death, where I found myself having to leave the dungeon to grind for bombs at least a few times. During one of these instances of leaving the dungeon, I was introduced to a godsend that I neglected picking up during the first quest. the magical shield, which blocks fireball attacks and Wizrobe magic. And there's a bunch more fireballs flying around in this version of the game. Like, look at this room. I was actually able to get through this room with a net increase in health because I didn't have to worry about fireballs flying at me as much with my new shield. Also, around this time, I stumbled across a secret room with an old man selling an upgraded bomb capacity, where I had just enough rupees to net me the upgrade and could now hold 12 at a time instead of the standard 8. All was going fine and dandy until...
It was at this moment that he knew. He f***ed up.
Yeah, I really screwed myself over. So with me not having enough rupees, I sadly had to do the unthinkable and get rid of one of my hearts permanently so that I could progress to the next room. Or so you may think. Luckily, Zelda 1 comes with an extra special feature that comes when you try to murder the old man. Fireballs of death that can slowly drain Link's health so that he can exit the dungeon without giving up an arm and a leg. But seriously, this whole take away your health permanently thing is so ridiculous that I couldn't help but chuckle to myself. Like, who the heck at Nintendo came up with this? It feels like something you would see in some Kaizo ROM hack, or if Zelda Maker was a thing. So after grinding for 50 rupees in the overworlds, I made it back to the room and paid my dues, and progressed to the Triforce Piece room after beating the boss, where I discovered yet another unorthodox feature. If you're not thinking, you would just pick up the Triforce Piece and leave the dungeon, but there's actually an invisible wall you have to walk through behind the Triforce, which leads to the dungeon item of the Raft that's necessary to beat the game. Yeah, this game's crazy, where all bets are off in the second quest. I was programmed to check every single wall I came across for invisible passageways and dungeons, so I found the secret easily, but if you have a keen eye and check your dungeon map you collected, you will realize there's a room above the Triforce room you hadn't been to yet, and upon walking against the wall, you'll find it. And so after getting the raft, that opened up a couple more additional areas I could check. I sailed north from the eastern dock to obtain a heart container, in the same location as the first quest, and sailed across the western dock to find level 5. I will only touch on level 5 briefly because not much happened here. This is where the Wizrobes were first introduced in the game, which my magical shield did wonders on. I also found the bow item here, which allowed me to take out the Goma mini-boss. And before I knew it, I took out the 3-headed Gleeok boss and put the dungeon in the books. Now at this point, I had no clue where I needed to go next. The dungeon item of the bow from level 5 couldn't unlock any additional secret areas I couldn't access previously, and I didn't have any old man clues that were yet to be solved. So at this point, I began wandering around the overworld, opening random secret locations that I remembered from playing the first quest, hoping there would be a dungeon entrance this time around instead of rupees, or God forbid the one where the old guy makes you pay money to repair his door. I even bought some medicine from the old lady in hopes that it would unlock some sort of progression, but that didn't do anything either. And so after wandering around for a couple of hours without any future dungeons found, and a crap ton of bills and door repairs, I was completely stuck. Is this where my playthrough ends? Am I even cut out to beat this game? I still had 4 dungeons left to find, and after 2 whole hours, I came up with nothing. Even if I did manage to stumble across one of the 4 after all this time, that would leave the remaining dungeons that would probably take even longer to find. I mean, we're probably talking several hours, even days to find the rest of them. I was dreading that it would come to this, but I knew what I had to do. I knew what it had to take to beat this monster of a game, but it would cause time to blur into an indeterminate stretch of existence due to how tedious these next several hours would be. I knew I had to burn every tree, bomb every wall, push every block, and use the flute on every single map tile of the overworld. Even saying that out loud sounds like torture. And so I listened to some music on the side, pulled up a map of the overworld on the side to check off each map tile as I explored, and mentally prepare myself for the grind of a lifetime. Bombing every single wall would take much longer compared to the other methods of checking for secrets because I could only hold 12 bombs at a time, and grinding for more when I ran out would take forever. There's a trick to getting bombs, or if you kill the 10th enemy with a bomb without taking damage while killing the previous 9 enemies, you'll be rewarded with 4 bombs, but even that takes a bit of time to do. I mean, there's what? Hundreds upon hundreds of walls to check? Just look at this map! So because of how long it would take, I decided to check all the trees first with my candle, because at least my candle has unlimited uses. Granted, there's still a crap ton of trees I had to check, and because I had the blue candle and not the red candle, I had to leave and re-enter a map screen just so I could use the candle again. but the average time to check a tree with the blue candle still worked out to be quicker than the average time to check a wall with a bomb. I started with burning trees in the southeast area of the map because there's a large population of trees there, and before I knew it, I burned a tree to unlock a secret staircase, and... Level 7. And what a tricky location for the tree. You have to burn the tree past the one you're standing next to, and once you unlock the staircase, you have to wrap around a few screens just so you can reach the dungeon. Very sneaky. Not long into playing through this dungeon, I encountered one of the greatest sins a game developer can put into a game. A softlock. Yup, I got softlocked in this room because I didn't have a stepladder item to progress to the next room, and couldn't kill Link to start at the beginning of the dungeon. So I had to reset my game, and guess who hadn't saved in about 2 hours or so? This guy right here. Luckily, I didn't lose that much progress. I mainly lost rupees that I acquired while burning at least 200 or so trees in the forest before stumbling across level 7. Upon returning to level 7 and trying to progress through an alternate route, I quickly realized the stepladder is required to beat the dungeon, which was most likely a dungeon item in one of the dungeons I hadn't found yet. Great. So then, I resumed my quest of burning down every single tree in the overworld like the little arsonist Link is. I figured the developers would not hide another dungeon under another tree so close to the level 7 location I just uncovered, so I ventured to the western portion of the map where I burned a lot of trees there, and even bombed quite a bit of walls, hoping I could uncover a dungeon that way. At this point, I had been using the flute item on every single screen I checked all the trees on as well, to hope that I could magically uncover something, but it hadn't been very effective, up until now. Wow, who would have guessed using the flute on this random screen would unlock a dungeon location? Like, I'm convinced the developers expected you to do what I'm doing and check every single possible path, because there was absolutely no indication you could do this with a flute. At least the lake you had to drain from the first quest had a hint centered around it that an old man tells you. Whatever, I guess I couldn't be too annoyed at this time, because now I only had 2 more dungeons I needed to find the locations of to beat the game. Now, if you thought level 6 from the first quest was difficult, you would be blown away at the difficulty of the second quest level 6, because this dungeon is no joke, and was the hardest dungeon I encountered in the game at this point. There were so many wizrobes in this dungeon, especially those blue ones that move around diagonally and deal more damage compared to the orange ones. My magical shield helped me a lot, but I sadly lost it at the beginning of the dungeon when a like ate it. Like, look at this room and tell me it's not impossible to get hit. You have 4 fireball statues shooting flames at you, wizrobes flying around, these balls of death flying around, and these gelatinous tubes trying to suck Link dry. Okay, pause on that last one, but you get my point that this dungeon is very hard. My main methodology while playing this dungeon would be to get to a room with enemies, exhaust almost all my health killing all enemies in the room, most likely die in the next room, heal myself with fairies in the overworld, and do the same thing for a room deeper in the dungeon. I could have just blasted through the rooms very quickly running past enemies, but I found that oftentimes if you kill all the enemies in a room, that unlocks a reward such as a key or lets you push a block so that you can unlock a hidden staircase. I wanted to be extremely thorough so that I wouldn't miss anything, such as a hidden dungeon item that could be valuable towards my progression. Speaking about dungeon items such as that, in this dungeon, I found the item that I was looking forward to collecting the most, the stepladder, which could let me progress further through Dungeon 7. Also in level 6, I found an old man that told me a hint of, south of arrow mark hides a secret. I wasn't too sure what the guy was talking about at the time, but I decided to write down his clue and save that knowledge for later. And so after several times of dying over and over again, and also getting a heart container on the overworld with my newly acquired stepladder, I took out the dungeon's boss, Goma, which was actually kind of a pain because I still hadn't purchased the magical shield yet that could have blocked all his fireballs. With 12 heart containers, I immediately went to the old man in the overworld with a magical sword and gladly picked up the most powerful sword in the game. I also went ahead and purchased the magical shield yet again because I had the funds and promptly made my way back to level 7. I feel like level 6 was harder than level 7, but what was annoying about level 7 is that there's not only one of these guys that try to steal one of your heart containers, but there's 2 of them in this dungeon. Like dang, the old men are hustlers in this version of the game. Their rigged gambling and door repair charges aren't enough apparently. They're out here taking your life if you don't pay up. Luckily, I had enough rupees to pay them, and I even found the red candle in this dungeon, which made me super happy because now I could burn trees in the overworld significantly faster compared to using the blue candle. And before I knew it, I took out the Gliok boss and put level 7 in the books, which I actually did not die in once, interestingly enough. The enemies weren't terribly challenging in this one, and my attack power of the magical sword was super effective at killing enemies fast. So now only 2 more dungeons to find, except this time I had a hint to go off of. South of Arrow Mark hides a secret. I did not think that hint applied to any of the dungeons that I had visited thus far, so I tried to think of potential locations it could apply to. And that's when I remembered the arrow screen on the overworld that housed the magical sword. South of the arrow made me think that there was some secret bombable passageway under the arrow on the same screen as it, but that didn't make any sense because you can only bomb open walls along the tops of screens in the overworld. So I then visited the screen below the arrow, which was a barren path of seemingly nothing. I tried to use my flute on that screen, which unlocked nothing. There was nothing else to do here besides maybe using my stepladder to cross the water and bomb each of the wall tiles, so I resorted to that. And I found level 8 just like that. I was super happy there was a hint leading me to this, because there was no way I was bombing this area anytime soon. I mean, you have to cross the water with the stepladder and then try bombing walls? That's pretty crazy stuff. So without further ado, I entered Dungeon 8. Level 8 was by far the most confusing dungeon I encountered thus far in regards to knowing where to go. It's littered with one-way doors, invisible passageways, walls you need to randomly bomb to progress, and what's absolutely insane is that there's a whopping 9 secret staircase passageways that lead to other parts of the dungeon, which makes this place a complete maze. I actually got lost halfway through it and had to write down on a scratched piece of paper what staircases and rooms lead to where, because it was too difficult to remember on the top of my head. Also, what tops the cake on difficulty is that there's not 1 Dodongo, not 2 Dodongos, not 3 Dodongos in this dungeon. No, there's a whopping 12 total Dodongos in this dungeon you can come across, where each takes 2 bombs to kill. So you need 24 total bombs at minimum to kill all the Dodongos here. I say at minimum because realistically, at least a few of them will juke you at the last second, causing you to waste precious bombs. I could have probably ran past a lot of the Dodongos without killing them, but remember, I wanted to be thorough in my playthrough so that I wouldn't miss any hidden items, so I ended up killing every single one of them. So as you might have guessed, this dungeon took a long time to beat, about 2 hours from start to finish to be exact, where a lot of that time included me needing to leave the dungeon to grind for bombs. Speaking of bombs, I was able to purchase the final bomb capacity upgrade in this dungeon, where I was able to hold 16 bombs, which was nice. Unfortunately, the upgrade was towards the end of the dungeon, so I wasn't able to utilize the upgrade for much of my time in this place. In addition to the extra bombs, I was able to obtain the fire rod item, which I admittedly never used, as well as the magical key, which basically acts as infinite keys, which would have been nice to have earlier on because I actually had to purchase a key at the shop at one point because I ran out of keys. But I guess it's not really worth complaining about at this point. And so after investing much of my time in this dungeon, and killing the boss of 3 Dodongos with fireballs flying from all directions, I obtained the last Triforce piece, where there was only 1 dungeon left to beat. Level 9. But first I had to find level 9 first, and I had absolutely no clue where it could be. Based on the levels 1 through 8 locations I discovered, none of these were located in the southwestern woods area, so I figured I would comb that area for the final dungeon. I found it unlikely that Nintendo would place the final dungeon anywhere close to the previous 8. I also thought it was convenient to check this area, because I had my red candle which I could use an infinite number of times per screen transition. And so as I burned every tree in that area, I came up with nothing new besides 100 rupees, and a guide charging me for a door repair. I also thought maybe that hint about the tree at the dead end could have held some significance here, but I came up with nothing. My next theory was that maybe level 9 was somewhere close to its location in the first quest. In the first quest, you unlocked level 9 by bombing Spectacle Rock, but maybe I could try bombing walls in this area to unlock the final dungeon in the second quest. I thought this because I noticed many of the dungeons in the second quest were close to dungeons in the first quest. Level 6 in the first quest, for example, is located just east of the graveyard, while level 6 in the second quest is located just a few screens over under one of the graves. Also, there's a dungeon between the 2 quests that's uncovered by burning a tree in the eastern woods just a few screens away from each other. I'm talking about level 8 from the first quest, and level 7 from the second quest. I would use up a lot of my time grinding for bombs to check all these rocks in the mountains, but maybe I was onto something. After clearing out the Spectacle Rock screen, I tried using the flute in the area 1 screen to the right, and and a heart container. I honestly don't think I'd ever been this displeased finding a hidden heart container before. It was definitely helpful, don't get me wrong, but all I wanted to do at this point was uncover the final dungeon so that I could beat the game and be done with it. But level 9 could be anywhere, where I was far from bombing every wall and burning every tree at this point. And so I slowly expanded my search outwards from Spectacle Rock, bombing many walls with the hopes of uncovering the final underground labyrinth. And after bombing a random wall at the northwestern screen on the map, I uncovered the final dungeon and a huge weight was lifted off my shoulders. Now I just needed to buckle down and beat the hardest dungeon in the game. And boy was level 9 long, confusing, and difficult. There were not as many staircases here compared to level 8, but there were hordes of difficult enemies, and there were these red and blue bubble enemies that were a particular pain in this dungeon. If you touch a red one, you lose the ability to use your sword, and you cannot regain the ability to use your sword until you touch a blue bubble or until you die. Like, even if you leave the dungeon after touching a red bubble and walk around the overworld, you still won't be able to use your sword, which I found absolutely crazy. These special types of bubbles existed in previous dungeons in the second quest, but their placement was the most annoying in this dungeon compared to any of the others. There's a few rooms pretty deep in this dungeon with just red bubbles in them without any blues, so in order to regain the ability to use your sword, you have to backtrack to hunt down the blue bubbles, and you need your sword to defeat Ganon, so it's not like you can just coast through the dungeon without your sword. So with all the backtracking and tons of rooms to get through, I died quite a bit. I did have a bunch of rupees saved up from killing enemies trying to find level 9, so I decided to buy a red potion from the old woman, and man oh man, was this potion a game changer. I can see why so many of you in my first quest video commented that I should have picked this up. At only 68 rupees, the red potion fills up your health completely when used, and it has two uses where after the first use, it turns into a blue potion. It's probably not as useful during the beginning of the game when you don't have many hearts, but during the end game when you have close to 16 hearts, this thing is so overpowered. Like, I was able to chill in the final dungeon for so long without dying with this thing. And so with my potion in hands, I found the silver arrows necessary to kill Ganon, and found the red ring for that sweet defense boost that made me an unstoppable war machine. And before I knew it, I used the remaining bit of my potion and entered the final fight against Ganon with full health. The fight against Ganon felt like the exact same fight from the first quest, which I would say was underwhelming, but it's honestly kind of a miracle that Nintendo was able to program an entire second quest into this game, so I shouldn't be the one to complain. And so I saved Zelda and beat the second quest totally blind. And wow, this was a journey alright. My whole playthrough took just under 20 hours, where much of that time was spent wandering around the overworld trying to find a lot of the later dungeons. And if you were curious, I died a total of 66 times. I also was surprisingly close to 100%ing this game, where the only thing I was missing was a singular heart container. That heart container can be found by playing the flute on one of the overworld screens with the levers that pop out from undergrounds. I actually did not make my rounds to thoroughly comb that area for secrets during my playthrough, which explains why I never came across it. Now here's a main question a lot of you probably want to ask me after watching this video. Do you recommend others trying to beat Zelda 1 Second Quest blind? Personally, I have mixed feelings about this question. If you're a hardcore Zelda fan who wants a challenge and enjoyed the first quest, I recommend it. The overworld map is not that big by modern gaming standards, where it's a total of 128 screens large, so even if you resort to bombing every single wall and burning every single tree like I did, it'll take a while, but it won't take you days or anything crazy like that. But it was incredibly boring combing through every map screen, so if you're stuck, I would recommend just looking up where the next dungeon is to save you time. The combat sections were more challenging compared to the first quest, but they were manageable, especially if you spend the time buying upgrades like the potion or magical shield. So that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to leave a like as well as a comment on what your experiences are with the second quest or with Zelda 1 as a whole. And make sure to check out my video where I played the first quest if you haven't seen that already. The link for that video is in the description. So with that, I'll see you in the next one.